In a land brimming with as much talent as Sumeru, one is practically spoiled for choice when it comes to designers. But when one thinks of architects, few are those who will not subconsciously think of Kaveh. The Kishwarawad graduate was once named the greatest architect in several decades and is known as the light of Kishwarawad. Kaveh himself, however, is unfortunately unmoved by this title. Such lovely names and titles are to him acknowledgement and shackles both. For example, Kaveh's insolvency remains a matter of shame for him to this day. A person with little to no standing could just admit to such a thing, but a famous architect cannot. In fact, such undue candor might result in a crisis of reputation for him. So, Kaveh cannot but avoid this topic to save face, and be forced to masquerade as a man living in leisure. Thanks to his abilities as a designer and his astounding aesthetic attainments, people believe in his talent, and thus in his facade also. After all, what could possibly trouble Kaveh, architect extraordinaire? Up till today, one could hear Kishwarawar students discuss and speculate about their alumnus Kaveh at the palace of Alcazar in various parts of the academia. In the hearts of his Darshan mates, Kaveh is a genius nigh unparalleled in the last few decades and an architect of great fame. Kaveh has, by his outstanding works, engraved his name into the history of the academia. If you were to meet Kishwarawar's students, it wouldn't hurt to listen to them extol his achievements, single-heartedly designing the Palace of Alcazar, renovating the landmark lighthouse of Port Ormos, modifying the port's elevators and cargo handling structures. His pioneering role in the spatial optimization in peripheral areas surrounding forests and valleys. The list goes on. Clad in these achievements, Kaveh has become more than a simple name, but a synonym for achievement in the field of design. Many wish they could have a resume like his, brilliantly talented in school, invited to work in various major construction agencies after graduation, and leaving after several years to do work under his own name. All outsiders' readings of his name stop here, and almost none know of the hidden truth behind the stories, the truth that Kaveh himself is trying to hide. It is true, of course, that he is an exceptional designer. It is a shame, then, this has not allowed him to live the perfect life that others think he does. He would summarize his past experiences in this way: misunderstandings are troublesome but inevitable. All people are vulnerable to momentary lapses in judgment and the influence of rigid labels. For example, their first reaction to designer is the fantasy of someone who earns mora with a flick of their fingers, who becomes famous with but a few strokes of a pen, and when people think about the arts, the first thing that emerges is the bizarre, unfounded image of some lackadaisical, self centered soul who swings between bouts of gloom and mania, and who is all too fond of bossing others about. Kaveh does not fit any such imaginative fantasies. He cannot complete his designs in a single stroke, instead approaching every job earnestly. He dresses like a successful person, but in truth, he does not judge the merit of a project by the remuneration alone. He is principled beyond most other people in Sumeru, believing that art is the wellspring of a life in design, and yet does not forsake humanistic purpose or practicality in the process. Indeed, he is willing to make some compromises for these two things. Sometimes he compromises on rest time, other times it is the ornamentation and trappings of the project, and sometimes it is his own pay. After many years, he finally succeeded. The palace of Alcazar was completed, and he returned to Sumeru in glory. His colleagues had naught but praise for the fabled palace atop a large tree. Stunned as they were by its designer's astounding imagination, they gorged themselves upon the way in which the structure united architectural function and human narrative into its elegant design values, resulting in luxurious craftsmanship that yet exists as a testament to precision and elegance, rewriting the atmosphere of the surrounding mountainous space with its very presence. None would say that the palace of Alcazar was any less than an exceedingly successful experiment. Those colleagues However, we're blissfully unaware of how Kaveh went bankrupt over this project due to a mix of personal principle, the vagaries of life, and other problems layered atop one another. After all, the truth, much like the troubled gestation of the success, has remained well hidden thanks to Kaveh's efforts. Kaveh was born into a classic scholarly family in Sumeru. His father was from the Ratadahist Darshan and once worked at the academia, while his mother had graduated from the Kishwarabar. And much as he would become later in life, she too was a famous architect. Influenced by them, Kaveh was interested in architectural design from a young age. They would sit in the living room as he sat at home playing with the block puzzles they had brought for him. Theirs was a house in which words were not necessary, and Kaveh would gain his understanding of home from this time. However, their blissful days were not to last. Some time before he joined the academia, his father would, at his encouragement, join the Interdarshan Championship. The competition itself was not a complicated affair, but his father, who had become a favorite to win, would miss becoming a champion by a hair, and then proceeded to go missing for a time afterward. Soon, the bad news came. His father had perished from an incident in the desert. The suddenness of this misfortune drove mother and son into disarray. His mother was hit particularly hard. Being a sensitive soul by nature, her husband's passing would cause her to break down, spending much time in anxious, gloomy thought. As for Kaveh, he would see his father's laugh and promise to bring something back nice for him as he walked out that door every time he closed his eyes to sleep. Young Kaveh thought that had he not said anything, his father might not have taken part in the contest, and he would not have gone missing afterward, and finally perished as a result. But no matter how he begged, the past could not be changed. His father's death, his mother's agony, all these things that could no longer be taken back were on the account of a single thing he had said. From that day forward, he would live under the shadow of that guilt. His mother would say that her husband was a man with a good heart, and that life at such a person's side made her happy. Indeed, after his passing, she would never again smile. Home went from a sanctuary of warmth and light to a cold and lonely hall. Kaveh would often find his mother sitting on the sofa, staring at her trembling hands in silence. She could neither draw anything at all, nor even conceive of a design in her mind. Each time this happened, Kaveh would feel like a giant hand was crushing him to the ground, and he would question himself, were it not for me, would the family have ended up like this? At that time, he was still young, and he could do very little. Out of that guilt, he would do his best to keep his mother company, and he would never wear a disappointed face around her, trying to support her in any way he could, even if such was but a drop in the bucket. It was amidst this chaos that Kaveh would reach schooling age and, having passed the entrance exams, enroll into Kishwadabad. During this time, he would inevitably spend less time with his mother. He would thus travel to Fontaine to ease her soul a little. There, she would receive a job offer, and upon returning to Sumeru, she informed Kaveh of the good news. Kaveh knew that this would leave him to live alone, but still, he agreed and even saw his mother off on the day she departed. He would continue to look on even after her ship had long left the harbor. He would even deeply miss her, but he knew that it was best that she left the place that had come to represent so much pain for her. For her sake, Kaveh would never admit that he was lonely. He assured her that he was all grown up now and could live independently, and if he should be kept awake at night by the loneliness, pain, or the memories of their now broken family, why, it was his just deserts for egging his father on to take part in the competition. One guilty of harming his parents so deeply deserved all that came to them, and so he must live on bearing that brand. Given how such thoughts have been his constant companions since, one could say that home taught Kaveh how to care, and also utterly purged him of the ability to knowingly harm another person. In the many years afterwards, he would fully remain trapped by his personality and ideals, desiring to help any and all who asked it of him, and unable to truly oppose others even if he wished to try and resist on some matters. Despite the good he often does, his guilt remains. More than this, he cannot accept pure goodwill, For when he makes the choices, he believes he should be punished and find some comfort in the pain. If Kaveh were a sculpture, he would be one that appeared all but flawless, but which would suffer utter destruction if it's the weak point in its core were to be found. After graduating, Kaveh's first project was helping out with a group project with other students of the same darshan, though they had been on different mentors. This being his debut as the person responsible for design, the work weighed heavily on him. But he is, by his own admission, a stubborn person, and he would spend all his energy on his work, and thus would he shoulder the work for others, heedless of the hour, on all manner of projects for 2 entire years. Once he had gained enough experience, Kaveh left these cooperative projects behind to work on his own name, gaining a clientele who appreciated his style. Some would ask him to design buildings, and this marked the beginning of his career. By a dint of his hard work, he was able to save up a good sum of mora. It did not take long, however, for Kaveh to hit a bottleneck. The demands of the current market were very different from academic design. It was more pragmatic, more snobbish, and the client's requirements were far harder to meet than his mentors had been. At the same time, academic trends in Sumeru were disrupting his work. He began to realize that his ideals and career goals were, as a certain someone had said, not easily attainable. New iterations of the schools of thought and viewpoints amongst researchers were constantly being created, and there was no lack of those who would engage in self critique and self reflexive questioning, with changes and improvements in social factors encouraging such considerations. As such, things that were once recommended might someday become objects of criticism, whether they be actual books or art. But other than those who had given themselves wholly over to art, no one could understand what artists in Sumeru had to endure. As academic accomplishment became ever more prized in Sumeru, researchers would in turn value pure academic accomplishments and practical skills more highly. The six sages would grow ever more radical in their ways, and the idea that the art provide no real benefits started to become more mainstream. Thus, those who worked in the arts would be marginalized, and those subjects that were often related to the arts sought to distance themselves. The engineering projects that Kaveh came into contact with were highly streamlined, bereft of flair or style. He would suggest various beautiful designs, only to have them rejected on the grounds that they were meaningless presentation, or that this project only needs practical buildings. His original pursuit was to make good designs for all that incorporated both artistic beauty and practicality, but now the arts had become a joke, and people rejected their necessity and value. No one would give him freedom to work on his designs. Pave, believing that the architecture was indeed art, resolutely opposed such viewpoints. But his job required him to have technical support and investments, and so he could not escape these circles, nor could he simply put his views out there in the open for fear that he might drag too many others down with him. With his dreams and career now at odds, Pave gave himself a long vacation, but when he returned home, he received an unexpected letter from Fontaine. It was from his mother, and she wrote that she had found someone to whom she could entrust the rest of her life, and as such was going to remarry in Fontaine. It was this news that she would, with great trepidation and expectation, relate to her only relative. Kaveh wrote back and congratulated her, and would even go to Fontaine to take part in the wedding. It was a simple affair, and only a few guests were present. Seeing his mother smile once more, Kaveh felt glad, but felt lost again almost immediately afterwards. His mother would leave all her property in Sumeru to him. 3 days later, he would return to Sumeru, and once again felt the terror of the empty home. The mere act of sitting on the sofa tormented him with a heretofore unmatched solitude. Here, he felt the old adage of all wise scholars being fulfilled. Do the right thing, no matter what it costs you. The more he continued to work in the construction industry, the stronger Kaveh's displeasure in the current state of society grew. It was at this moment that a turning point came. The wealthy merchant, Lord Sangama Bey, sought him out to construct a private mansion. Lord Sangema Bey had become fairly famous, but Kaveh had no idea that this lord's name was in fact Dori until they met. Nor did he have any reckoning of her power and riches. She had only two conditions for this mansion: that it be large and extravagant. Kaveh would probe her concerning design style and other details, but she was concerned not with such. Even amongst his clients, Dori stood out as a bit of an oddity. She did business, but seemed to care little for what researchers thought. She wanted her mansion built in a secluded place for business needs, or so she claimed. And Kaveh was told not to ask too many questions and simply aim to make a truly awe-inspiring estate. As for aesthetics, Dori neither cared nor stopped him from doing anything he wished. Kaveh realized almost immediately how rare it was to come by such a commission. A mansion construction project without limitations meant that he could put his all into it. Party A would fork out the resources, while Party B would do the work. Was this not how their business should be? And was allowing academic views to restrict development and growth not utterly wrong-headed? So it was with that, Kaveh threw himself in planning these designs with a sudden fervor, and in his role as Party B, he advised Dori to make some adjustments. A true mogul could not simply live in the mountains. If this estate was to go down in history, it had to be something of truly legendary beauty. The garden was a must, with the flowers carefully selected, of course. With the input of professional botanists, the conceptualization must be bold, the planning conscientious. The buildings themselves would prioritize practicality, but the requested warehouses and facilities would rest upon a luxuriant foundation. And as for location, the cliffside in the northern mountains looked good. Lord Sangama Bay would awaken every day with a window onto the loveliest natural views that could be heard. Though Dori would constantly insist that the mansion did not have to be close to a cliff, Ave's engineering spirit and aesthetic appetites drove him on to convince her otherwise. Thus did the project begin with a flourish, and as the days passed, work proceeded apace under Kave's watchful eye. Yet his ideals would not be so easily achieved, for though Kave's diligence in selecting a site had been immaculate, and he had made every consideration, he could not have anticipated the speed at which the withering would expand its reach that year. When the work was 70% complete, on a quiet night, the withering crept in silently, destroying all that had been built overnight. The sight of his creation's devastated corpse struck Kaveh like a furious thunderbolt. Dori, who had rushed down upon receiving the news, was in incomparable fury, demanding that Kaveh leave the project. Though the forest rangers quickly dispersed the withering, the buildings were beyond saving. Yet he knew that it would be difficult to ever get a chance of this sort again, and so he begged Dori to let him finish the palace of Alcazar. Dori would point out that the crucial problem with stark sharpness. He had been the one to insist on the change of site. Now that the palace had been destroyed, taking the investment put in thus far with it, how could the project continue, even assuming that she did not pursue the matter with him? If they were to rebuild the structure, who would bear the cost for the losses? Kaveh sat atop the ruins as he contemplated this all night long. He had his savings, and the property his parents had left behind, and that had once been his home, but now it was just an empty building. And what was a home anyway? An architect like him knew better than most that a construction bereft of a family or home to dwell in was no home. It was simply a building. And when the sun rose, Kaveh returned to Sumeru and sold that house, adding all the proceeds from that sale along with his savings to the funds that Dori provided with him. He was able to come up with 70% of the necessary mora required, and Dori coming up with the rest. Thus was the palace of Alcazar built on a beautiful sunny day. Kaveh had given all he possessed to build the legendary palace that did not belong to him in the slightest. He did not earn a single mora on this project. On the contrary, some slight overspending on the follow-up work would leave him heavily in debt to Dori. While Kaveh had made a token show of resisting, he knew in his heart that he could not deny the fact that he did indeed owe this debt. His heart was once again consumed by that old guilt, and Lord Sangama Bey, shrewd merchant that she was, could immediately perceive that he was not paying for her sake, but for that of his ideals. And if someone wanted to martyr their entire fortune on the altar of their ideals, who was she to stop them? Construction was ultimately just business, but ideals were priceless. As for how Kaveh would become homeless afterward, that is a different story. After going bankrupt, Kaveh entered into a period of melancholy. The palace of Alcazazare had ever so briefly filled the hole in his heart that had been ripped open by so many things, but it had also proved to him once again that no matter what he gave to attain his ideals, it wasn't enough. He was now directionless and enmeshed in a world where he could not go anywhere without Mora, and yet he was accustomed, since his youth, to putting on a brave front, and so Kaveh was unwilling to let his colleagues and friends know that he was nigh penniless, even after selling all he owned, and so he went to a tavern, where he would order a few bottles and chat to comfort himself. One bottle later, he would collapse at the table, only to wake up in the same exact position afterward. Lambad, the tavern owner, had reserved a seat and a few free drinks for him out of kindness, and as thanks, Kaveh helps him redesign and refit the booth sitting area of the cavern's second floor. He would occasionally meet friends from academia, and with them, he would pretend that he was just there to drink and gather inspiration. He would spend over a fortnight in this manner, during which he would encounter that friend he no longer called friend. When discussing Kaveh's old friends, the current academia scribe, Alhaitham of Hadavatat, will invariably get mentioned. Alhaitham enrolled at a later date than most those of his age, but his grades stood out above the rest. People didn't know who he was or where to find him normally, only that he was some student who had gotten high marks, and when his name was mentioned, even the old researchers from Kishwadawad would shake their heads and say that he was too intelligent by half and hard to get along with. At that time, Kaveh had just parted ways with his mother and was living alone. He would meet this junior student in the library sometimes and would speak to him out of curiosity. And thus did he meet the Haravatat genius Al-Haytham. But time would go on to prove that wishful thinking alone does not make friends. For Kaveh quickly realized that Al-Haytham, though 2 years his junior and admittedly both extremely talented and incredibly gifted, was also utterly different from him, whether it be in personality, dealing with people, academic direction, and convictions. Kaveh's time in school would leave him with a great many memories, and the least pleasant of which is the group project they undertook together. Each recognized the other's ability, and they decided to conduct research regarding the ancient structures, ancient runes, and linguistics, with Kaveh suggesting that Al-Haytham be the one responsible for selecting a topic. At first, others would take part in the cooperative project, but as their work progressed, the other students dropped out gradually as they could not keep up. That was the first time Kaveh realized the brutal and all too intuitive difference in talent between individuals. The academia linked talent and resources to an extreme degree, and all here knew that. As Al Haytham liked to put it, certain matters have their upper limit determined by talent and their lower bound determined by hard work. Ordinary people and geniuses would be separated by various practical realities, and they did not have to force themselves to fit into a group they did not belong to. Kaveh, however, was resolute in his belief that this was all the result of obstacles that occurred during the process, and that wisdom should be uncovered by many people. To prevent the other students from backing out, Kaveh spent as much time and effort helping them with their work, placing a great burden at his own shoulders. Al-Haytham persisted in upholding the opposite view, believing Kaveh to be too idealistic in his ways. Academia was not charity work, and temporary salvation would not change the reality of their differences in ability. Thus did discord arise between the two. Finally, the day came when only two people remained working on the topic, Alhaitham and Kaveh. The disputes between them accumulated to a critical mass before exploding spectacularly. Kaveh maintained that Alhaitham was too much of an egoist, and that he could be much better welcomed amongst people if he would just care about helping out more often. Alhaitham, for his part, pointed out that Kaveh's impractical idealism was just a flight from reality, and that would become a burden on his existence someday, and the source of Kaveh's altruism was not but his inescapable sense of guilt. At that moment, more than anything else, Kaveh felt cut to the quick by someone who was his best friend. Alhaitham had seen through the reality that he had never been able to face, causing him to feel reality's bite for the first time, a feeling that made Kaveh steadfastly declare that he regretted making friends with this all too intelligent person. The two parted ways in a single stroke. Alhaitham would remove his name from that thesis, while Kaveh would rip his copy of the thesis apart in a fury, only to put it back together with deep regret. He sensed that he would not be able to change his friend, with the reverse also being true. Afterwards, the two would later clash in academic journals several times, each criticizing the other's perspective. Before this, the Decoding the Runes and Architectural Philosophy of the Ruins of King Deshret's Civilization had made great progress. Its roots on the linguistics front had filled various gaps on the grammatical logic of some ancient minor languages, allowing for the successful interpretation of many important texts. Similarly, the results archived in architectural studies had successfully improved the load-bearing structures for some special terrain features in Sumeru, which greatly improved the lives of those living in remote regions. To encourage the project, the academia had even specially designated a research site for its use. Unfortunately, lacking manpower and a united vision on the part of its primary researchers, it eventually grounded to a halt. This failed project became an unavoidable part of Kaveh's past. As the years went by and he was beaten back by reality time and time again, Kaveh was forced to admit that his persistence, born of wishful thinking, was not always useful. It was only when he was rendered penniless that he finally understood the deepening meaning of his friend's past words. A person who wished to ascend to the Garden of Heaven upon steps of thin air would inevitably plant their feet in an empty stair and fall to their death. As a genius, Kaveh longed to belong in a crowd, subconsciously fearing separation from it. This was the difference between him and Alhaitham. Returning to the matter of that table in the tavern, Kaveh was deeply shocked to see Alhaitham, who was coincidentally present to purchase some alcohol in this place. Alhaitham, for his part, could immediately tell that Kaveh was in a very bad way. Having been oppressed by life for too long, Kaveh fully unloaded all his woes onto his erstwhile friend right there and then. After all, there was nowhere to hide from his problems, so what use was it concealing them in front of the one friend with whom he had fallen out of so acrimoniously? He would lament about a great many misfortunes that had befallen him, only falling silent when they left the tavern in the dead of night, and his eyes fell upon a place in the distance that he once called home. Alhaitham, on the other hand, listened intently to Kaveh's words, and seeing through him once more, asked him a difficult question. How has realizing your ideals gone for you? Only reality can force a researcher to admit they were wrong, but Kaveh did not know what he should consider reality. He yearned for a fantasy so perfect and beautiful that none need flee it. Even if the price of his dream was losing himself, he still firmly believed that his ideals were in themselves not mistaken, and that the fault lay only in the methods used to achieve them. People should not give up, for even if they are doing good in an attempt to make up for something, the results will still have meaning for some. Even if he could not enter that promised land of his ideals, that did not mean the radiance and the attraction of such a realm should be denied. As for those phantasm-like realities, like how he found his homeless self living in his friend's house by happenstance, or how his house, now under the scribe's name, had been converted from that same research center the academia had offered them back in the day, or how this excess academic asset would not have been turned into a residence at all after numerous transactions, had Kaveh not resolved to give it up, or how, knowing full well that Alhaitham never did perform a good deed unconditionally, Kaveh would be plagued by guilty conscience and proactively mention helping with household chores, only to become saddled with all of those domestic errands. These might be an annoyance for someone at a low point in life, but they are also proof the most unshakable part of one's past is a friend that will never change. Rationality and sensibility, language and architecture, knowledge and human feelings, things that can never be integrated are what constitute the two sides of the mirror, indeed, of the entire world. While he was still a student, Kaveh would often be busy with various projects. During this time, he would visit numerous ruins with fellow students. They were all very young at the time, and were as yet unable to descend into the heart of the tombs, but they managed to achieve significant results nonetheless. However, The study of ancient ruins comes with its risks, and they would find themselves imperiled despite their professionalism. During one such search, the student team encountered some danger. There was a cave in. If not for Kaveh pushing two fellow Kishwadawar students out of the tomb, they surely would have perished there. As for Kaveh himself, though he also escaped with some light injuries, he could not stop his fellow students' change of heart. He believed that he was helping them achieve results, but instead, most of his fellow students saw only a perceived difference in ability, and troubled by the situation, they elected to quit the project. Kaveh knew of the objects known as visions. He had originally thought that they would appear at moments of crisis, but he had been through one such mortal crisis already, and he had not received the favor of the gods, but instead had to use all his strength to drag everyone out of the fire. Years later, Kaveh graduated, left the academia, and threw himself into his work. He had by then ceased to think about visions for some time, or even consider further as to what kind of people would come into possession of such an item. People said that only those with the wish could receive divine favor this way. Perhaps he was just not such a person. Everything that happened after flowed like a stream of water, dull and unchanging. He would busy himself with design work, for a while becoming overwhelmed with the lack of acknowledgement of the arts, causing him to feel fatigued. His mother would set up a new family in Fontaine, leaving the house and her other possessions to him, her son. He could do nothing about these things, and they also felt unremarkable and unworthy of mention. This persisted till the day the first version of the palace of Alcazar was destroyed by the withering, and he was sitting upon that wreck of a building, contemplating the whole night through. Suddenly, he had resolved to boldly bet it all on chasing the dream before him, come what may. Thus did he return home and quickly hit up the relevant departments to put things in order. Coincidentally, that day was a smooth one for transactions, and Kaveh only spent half a day transferring ownership of his house, coming to possess a sum of mora that he would later redirect to the project. After settling a host of trivial matters, Kaveh would return to the old home he had lived in for so many years for the final time. He would use flatbread to place a simple palace of alcazazare upon his plate, drizzled with sauce and yogurt, making himself a beautiful snack in the process. This dish was not hard, and he had been taught to make it by his father in his youth. He had not made that dish much since his father's passing, and it was merely impulse that guided him to give it a try that day. This was not his favorite dish exactly, but a sudden bitterness stole its way up his throat, and he made to smash the flatbread palace and start eating. Within the shattered bread palace lay a shimmering vision. Kaveh stared at it, unable to believe his eyes. It had arrived quite a few years late, but here it still lay before him, as gorgeous as some fantastic sky realm, and thankfully, it was a lot closer to him than his ideals were. And that is Kaveh Genshin Impact story. Anyone listening in, thank you so much, and I appreciate you. This guy has an insane story and really has grown to be one of my favorite characters of the Sumeru arc. Anyone still listening in, I appreciate you so much, and I will see you in patch 3.7. Bye, friends.